November 3rd, 1978. A 19-year-old college student steps off campus into the crisp Quebec evening. She's missed her usual bus home, but it's only a short walk to her dormitory. The next morning, her bed remains untouched. Her books still sit on her desk. Her worried roommates call her name through empty hallways. 5 months later, a farmer discovers something in a creek near Compton. What he finds will haunt a family for decades and expose a justice system that failed at every turn. This is the story of Theresa Allore, a case so mishandled that it would take her brother 27 years to uncover the truth authorities refuse to see. A young woman vanishes without a trace. A family fights for answers. And somewhere in the shadows of rural Quebec, a truth darker than anyone imagined waits to be uncovered. What really happened to Theresa Allore? If you're new here, this channel covers cases that demand justice. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell, because this story will change how you see unsolved mysteries forever. Theresa Allore was the kind of student every parent hoped their child would become. Responsible, focused, well-liked by her peers at Champlain College in Lennoxville, Quebec. She had a routine that rarely changed. Classes during the day, the same bus home each evening, studying in her dormitory room. Her friends described her as someone you could count on, someone who didn't take unnecessary risks. Lennoxville in 1978 was a small college town where everyone knew everyone, the kind of place where students felt safe, walking alone after dark, where dormitory doors stayed unlocked, where the biggest worry was making it to morning lectures on time. Champlain College sat nestled in Quebec's eastern townships, surrounded by rolling hills and quiet creeks that would soon become part of a much darker story. November had arrived early that year, bringing with it the first real bite of Canadian winter. Students hurried between buildings, collars turned up against the cold. It was the kind of evening where missing your usual bus meant a long, uncomfortable walk home through empty streets. For Theresa, that missed bus would change everything. November 3rd, 1978, started like any other Thursday for Theresa Allore. She attended her classes at Champlain College, sat through lectures, took notes in her careful handwriting. As evening approached, she gathered her books and headed toward the bus stop, where she caught the same route home every day. But on this particular night, something was different. The bus pulled away without her. Her roommates back at King Hall Dormitory didn't think much of it at first. Theresa was responsible, but she was also 19. Maybe she'd gone to the library. Maybe she was studying with friends. When she didn't return by midnight, they assumed she was staying overnight somewhere else. It wasn't until the next morning, when her bed remained perfectly made and her books sat untouched on her desk, that worry began to creep in. The hours that followed painted a picture of a young woman who had simply vanished. No one remembered seeing her after she missed that bus. No friends had spoken to her. No phone calls had been made. It was as if Theresa Allore had stepped into the cold Quebec evening and disappeared into thin air. Days turned into weeks. Her family arrived from Ontario, desperate for answers. They walked the streets of Lennoxville, knocked on doors, spoke to anyone who would listen. The police response was lukewarm at best. Missing college students weren't unusual, they said. She was probably just taking a break from school. Maybe she'd gone to Montreal. Maybe she'd run away with a boyfriend. But Theresa's family knew better. This wasn't a girl who ran away. This wasn't someone who would disappear without a word, leaving her worried family to wonder and wait. Something terrible had happened to their daughter, their sister. They could feel it in their bones. Winter deepened. Snow covered the eastern townships. Life at Champlain College continued, but there was an unease now in the dormitory hallways, a sense that something safe had been broken. Students walked in groups after dark. Parents called more often. The comfortable illusion of small-town safety had been shattered. Weeks became months. Christmas came and went. Theresa's birthday passed, unmarked. Her family refused to give up hope, but with each day that slipped by, that hope grew thinner. Where was she? What had happened on that cold November evening? When she missed her bus, the answer would come in the cruelest possible way. April 13th, 1979. Spring was finally arriving in Quebec, melting the winter snow and swelling the creeks that ran through the countryside. A local farmer was checking his property near Compton when he noticed something in the water that shouldn't have been there, something that made him stop, look closer, and then run for the nearest telephone. What he found was Theresa Allore. She had been lying in that creek for months, hidden beneath ice and snow, waiting for the spring thaw to reveal the truth. The young woman who had vanished on a cold November evening was found wearing only her undergarments, her other clothes nowhere to be seen. She was approximately 1 kilometer from King Hall, the dormitory where her roommates had waited for her to come home. The discovery should have launched a massive investigation. Instead, it marked the beginning of a cover-up that would last decades. Police arrived at the scene and made a decision that would haunt the Allore family forever. This wasn't a case, they declared. This was a troubled young woman who had taken her own life or overdosed on substances. Case closed, but the evidence told a different story, one that authorities seemed determined not to hear. The creek where Theresa was found wasn't a place someone would go to end their life. The condition of her remains suggested she had been there since shortly after her disappearance. Most telling of all, the coroner who examined her body noted something that should have changed everything: marks consistent with strangulation around her neck. Yet somehow, the official cause of death was listed as violent death of undetermined nature. The investigation that should have followed never came. The justice that Theresa deserved was denied before it could even begin. Her family stood at that creek in April 1979, looking down at the place where their daughter had been found, and realized they were entirely alone in their fight for the truth. What do you think happened to Theresa Allore? Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if you want to see more cases like this. The investigation into Theresa Allore's disappearance should have been one of the most thorough in Quebec's history. Instead, it became a masterclass in how authorities can fail a victim and her family at every possible turn. When Theresa first went missing, the Sûreté du Québec treated her disappearance as routine. Missing college student, probably a runaway. The officers assigned to the case seemed more interested in finding reasons why Theresa had left voluntarily than in discovering what had actually happened to her. They theorized she was troubled, that she had personal problems, that she'd simply decided to start a new life somewhere else. Her family knew this narrative was completely wrong. Theresa wasn't troubled. She wasn't the type to abandon her education, her family, her entire life without a word. But their protests fell on deaf ears. The police had made up their minds, and no amount of evidence to the contrary seemed to matter. When Theresa's body was found in April 1979, the family expected everything to change. Finally, authorities would have to take this case seriously. Finally, there would be a real investigation. They were wrong. The crime scene was processed with shocking carelessness. Evidence that should have been collected was ignored. The area wasn't properly secured. Most damaging of all, the official response seemed designed to support the original theory, rather than follow where the evidence led. The coroner's findings should have been a wake-up call. Marks consistent with strangulation. A body found in a location that made no sense for self-harm. A young woman discovered wearing only undergarments, with her other clothing nowhere to be found. These weren't the hallmarks of an overdose or a troubled student making bad choices. These were the signs of something far more sinister. What authorities discovered in the weeks following should have launched a homicide investigation. Theresa's wallet was found 16 kilometers away from where her body was discovered. Her identification was still inside, but any money was gone. This wasn't the behavior of someone who had taken their own life. This was someone whose belongings had been deliberately scattered. Witnesses began coming forward with information that painted a disturbing picture. There were reports of a vehicle chasing a young woman in the area around the time of Theresa's disappearance. Descriptions of suspicious activity near the college campus. Stories that should have been thoroughly investigated, but were instead dismissed or ignored. Every attempt by the Allore family to push for a proper investigation was met with resistance. Police insisted there was no evidence of foul play. Despite the coroner's findings, they maintained their original theories about Theresa being a runaway or a troubled student. Even when faced with evidence to the contrary, the family found themselves fighting, not just for answers, but for the basic acknowledgement that their daughter deserved justice. They were told to move on, to accept the official version of events, to stop asking uncomfortable questions. The system that should have been working for them had become their greatest obstacle. Faced with official indifference, Theresa's brother, John, made a decision that would consume the next 3 decades of his life. If the authorities wouldn't investigate his sister's case properly, he would do it himself. He began collecting evidence, interviewing witnesses, building the case that police should have built decades earlier. John's investigation revealed connections that authorities had missed or ignored. Other young women had disappeared or been found dead in the Quebec region during the same time period. There were patterns, similarities, evidence of what could be a serial offender operating in the eastern townships, information that should have been front and center in any proper investigation. Years of relentless work by John Allore began to pay off. His advocacy, his research, his refusal to accept the official narrative finally forced authorities to take notice. In 2004, 25 years after Theresa's body was found, the Sûreté du Québec established a cold case unit, partly in response to his efforts. But by then, crucial evidence had been lost. Witnesses had died. Memories had faded. The investigation that should have happened in 1979 was finally beginning in 2004, but the trail had gone cold in ways that might never be recovered. So far, police had no leads, no motive, and no suspect. Yet the town wasn't sleeping easy, because everyone knew that whoever had taken Theresa Allore was still out there, and they had gotten away with it for 25 years. The question that haunted everyone was simple. What else had they gotten away with? But John Allore's investigation was about to uncover something that would shake the foundation of everything authorities thought they knew about his sister's case. As he dug deeper into the records, cross-referencing dates and locations, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Theresa wasn't the only young woman who had vanished from the eastern townships during that time period. Between 1975 and 1980, at least 4 other cases bore striking similarities to his sister's disappearance. Young women, all between the ages of 18 and 22, all last seen in the evening hours, all found months later in remote locations, their cases either mishandled or completely ignored by authorities. The most chilling discovery came when John obtained files that had been buried for decades. Louise Camirand, a 20-year-old who disappeared in 1977, was found near a creek, just like Theresa. Manon Dubé, 19, vanished in 1978 and was discovered in circumstances that mirrored his sister's case almost exactly. These weren't isolated incidents. This was a pattern. Even more disturbing was what John discovered about the timeline. The cases weren't random occurrences spread across years. They clustered around specific periods, suggesting someone who operated in cycles, who struck when conditions were right, who understood how to avoid detection in the vast wilderness of rural Quebec. The revelation that authorities had failed to connect these cases wasn't just negligence, it was a systematic failure that had allowed someone to continue operating for years without consequence. Each case had been treated as isolated, each victim dismissed as a runaway or a troubled young woman. No one had been looking for the connections because no one believed they existed. John's research revealed something even more shocking. Witness statements from different cases described similar vehicles, similar suspicious behavior, similar circumstances, information that should have been shared between investigations but never was, evidence that could have led to an arrest decades earlier, left to gather dust in separate files. But the most haunting discovery was yet to come. John found records of cases that extended beyond the 1970s, disappearances that continued into the 1980s and beyond, young women who vanished from the same region, found in the same type of remote locations, their cases handled with the same institutional indifference. The implications were staggering. If John was right, if these cases were connected, then Theresa hadn't been the victim of a random crime. She had been taken by someone who had done this before, someone who would do it again, someone who had been operating with impunity for decades. The brother who had started this journey looking for answers about one case had uncovered evidence of what could be one of Canada's most prolific unidentified offenders. And that person, after all these years, was likely still out there. The truth John Allore uncovered was both a breakthrough and a devastating confirmation of institutional failure. In 2004, his relentless advocacy finally forced the creation of Quebec's Cold Case Unit. After 25 years of official indifference, authorities were finally willing to acknowledge that Theresa's case deserved a real investigation, but the delay had cost everything. Evidence that should have been preserved was gone. Witnesses who could have provided crucial testimony had passed away. The crime scene where Theresa was found had been disturbed countless times over the decades. The trail that should have been fresh in 1979 was now ice cold. The Cold Case Unit reviewed the files with fresh eyes and came to the conclusion the Allore family had reached decades earlier. This was a case that demanded justice. The official cause of death was quietly changed, finally acknowledging what the coroner had noted in 1979. Theresa Allore had been the victim of foul play. Yet even with this acknowledgement, answers remained elusive. The person responsible for Theresa's disappearance had been given a 25-year head start. They had lived free while the family suffered, while justice was denied, while other potential victims may have crossed their path. Today, 47 years after that cold November evening, when Theresa missed her bus, the case remains officially unsolved. The eastern townships hold their secrets close, and somewhere in those rolling hills and quiet creeks, the truth about what happened to a 19-year-old college student continues to wait. John Allore's fight transformed Canadian cold case investigations and gave voice to families who had been ignored by the system. His sister's case became a catalyst for change, ensuring that future families wouldn't face the same institutional indifference. But for the Allore family, the most important question remains unanswered. Who took Theresa? Where are they now? And how many other families are still waiting for the truth? In the quiet halls of what was once Champlain College, students still walk the same paths Theresa Allore walked on that November evening in 1978. The dormitory where her roommates waited for her to come home has been renovated, but the memory lingers. A young woman stepped into the darkness and never returned, leaving behind questions that echo through decades. Some say justice was served when authorities finally acknowledged the truth about Theresa's case. Others believe the real answers died with witnesses who were never interviewed, evidence that was never collected, leads that were never followed. The person responsible for her disappearance may still be walking free, their identity protected by institutional failure and the passage of time. Theresa Allore was 19 years old when she vanished. She would be 66 today. Her case changed how Canada handles missing persons investigations, but it couldn't bring her home. It couldn't give her the life she deserved, the future that was stolen from her on a cold Quebec evening. The eastern townships keep their secrets, but they also remember, and somewhere in those hills, in those creeks, in those quiet spaces where the wind whispers through the trees, Theresa's story continues to demand the one thing she has never received, the truth. If this case moved you, subscribe for more stories that refuse to be forgotten. Check out our investigation into another Canadian mystery that shocked the nation. And remember, every unsolved case is someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's fight for justice that continues long after the headlines fade. What do you think happened to Theresa Allore? Share your thoughts below.